Welcome to This Week in Heresy, Episode 71, Creating Interfaith Families, with our guest, Rabbi Mychal Copeland. Hey, Michael, welcome to This Week in Heresy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So for the sake of our audience, introduce yourself and talk a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Absolutely. So I'm Mychal Copeland. I'm the rabbi and director of an organization. It's a national organization, and I'm the local director of InterfaithFamily. So I work with couples and families and institutions to try to make a more welcoming Jewish community wherever we can. And I'm also the co-editor of the book Struggling in Good Faith, LGBTQI Inclusion from 13 American Religious Perspectives. I became a rabbi in the year 2000 after studying at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, a kind of small rabbinical college in Philadelphia, a great place that tends to be on the progressive end of contemporary Judaism. And I decided to become a rabbi after largely because I was at Harvard Divinity School before that, studying for a master's in theological studies. And it was actually the interaction with friends there who were on a path to become Christian clergy people that I realized that I really wanted to become a rabbi. So watching them and seeing the work that they were doing, they were community organizers, they were teachers, they were pastoral counselors. That's what I wanted to be. And it made me realize that I just wanted to be that in my own home tradition with my own stories and language and conversations.
Interesting. I could totally see that because, there's nothing quite like being in the seminary environment to really kind of, and it happened to quite a few people actually, like being in the seminary environment, and then a lot of the MTS, I've seen at least several MTS students go back into an MDiv program instead. They're like, yeah, I was into MTS and then I saw what you all were doing and yeah, now I'm this.
Exactly. I knew many people who had that experience as well. And basically, I had the same experience. It was just that I couldn't become a clergy person within an MDiv program. So I needed to go the rabbinical school route. But it was the same kind of experience. Like, oh, do I want to do solely academic work? No, I'm actually seeing what these people are doing on the ground and how they're transforming liturgy and creating ritual and being there for communities. That was the work that I wanted to be doing. So it was another 5 years from there. And then I became a rabbi.
So is basically rabbinical school similar to seminary in the same context? Like you're put in these classes about studying the Bible, studying traditions, studying how to do the services, et cetera, et cetera?
Basically, yes. We do all of that. And there's just a lot of history, language, civilizational work to do too. So there's some texts. My school in particular would go through history one period at a time. So we start with the biblical period and learn about that cultural milieu, learn that language, learn all of the theology and issues that were coming up at that time. And then we move on to the next period and work our way through the long span of Jewish history.
What is, when you're in rabbinical school, what is the big kind of sticking point? Because there's certain things in Christian seminary that people are waiting to jump on and talk about, a lot of, especially in Old Testament class, everybody wants to talk about, at least in our seminary, because it was very open about LGBTQ stuff. Everybody wanted to jump on those passages in Exodus, about condemning homosexuals and trying to prove it wrong and making sure that we know what they say. Is there anything in particular like that happens in rabbinical school?
I mean, my rabbinical school also was a place where LGBT issues were discussed quite a bit. But I don't know at the point that I came into the school that was where a lot of the energy was. It kind of depends on the people who are there and what's going on at that moment in time. There are, I would say, a lot of issues. I mean, one, I think that is there at this period in our history, regardless of the particular year or decade, is just how to balance the historical approach to text with the idea that we're looking at a living, breathing document or documents that are perhaps filled with divinity or come from a divine place. Ooh, but we also know that historically these came out of a particular time period and we need to see that. Whoa, how do I balance all that? How do I carry that? for myself? And then how am I going to teach that? Am I going to teach it in this way or that? Or will I try to bring in both? And do they conflict? Maybe they don't conflict. But for people who are not only looking at the field academically, but want to bring it to people in a very living way, like, wow, this is a way that we can actually think about how to live our lives, we need to work that stuff out. So I think that was there, I think, for every generation in my school of folks going through, as it is, I think, for a lot of seminarians who are coming at it from a kind of progressive academic approach and really wanting to see the holiness embedded in the tradition. So I think that that's there. We did have conversations around LGBT issues and those texts and how to have those conversations in the Jewish communities. There were already a lot of conversations at the point that I was in rabbinical school about interfaith marriage and relationships. And, is that different if you're a lesbian? And like all the different questions that are layered upon that, and what kinds of contemporary reactions made a lot of sense and what kind of contemporary reactions are actually going to set us back. And we actually had a debate that's been going on for years and years that is still going on about whether or not seminarians themselves can be interpartnered. And my school was just the first rabbinical school to make a very public announcement that we would accept people who are interpartnered with someone who's not Jewish just a few months ago. So this is a very living argument. I would say the other one is around Israel, which is always pretty contentious within the Jewish community and out. So that was certainly always there as well.
Definitely. I want to go back a little bit because you're talking about the Bible being a living document. And, it's interesting. I've been talking a lot online to some people because a lot of people can't really wrap their head around my Wiccan and being Wiccan and Christian. And they're like, well, what about the Bible? And I'm like, but that's kind of it's a document that you have to interpret it, at least in my view, you have to interpret given your time, and you have to understand that the context of when it was written and how that it is an ancient context, not our modern context. And like, you have to really think about how to interpret that in a modern for our modern times. And can you? So is that a big kind of debate? Like, and how do you see that kind of interpretation?
I think that it's really difficult in that, at least in the Jewish tradition, we read this text in a sacred space, in a sacred way every single week. So we're confronted with the words, we're confronted with the idea that this is living in the sense that I want to glean for myself today what wisdom there might be embedded in that text. So if I'm holding at the same time that this text is coming out of a particular time period, when do I say, this is something that some might say eternal, this is something that for all time, or at least for me in my moment, could be really relevant and incredibly meaningful? And where do I say, no, not that one. That one, no. That one I have to place in its historical context. Are there sometimes ways to do both at the same time? I think that's where it gets really sticky around, for example, gay and lesbian issues today. We look at those texts in Leviticus and elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures, and we say, okay, historicizing, with the historicizing brain, I say no. I say that has nothing to do with what we're talking about today. Those texts that are condemning do not speak to me today in a meaningful way about my life or about anyone else's life. So when do I get to they say that? And then I can say, these words, this just lifted up my day and listen to this piece of Torah. So I think that gets really tricky. I believe that we do both of those. I actually believe that in some ways that's happened over history in a lot of our traditions, that we're not the first to have to look at text with a lot of different lenses. So can we do that? And can we hold paradoxes? I think that we actually can. And yes, we still read it. And in the Jewish tradition, we read every word. We chant it, actually. And if there's something I can chant it in a beautiful melody, and 10 minutes later in the service, when it's time to talk about that piece, I can argue it, I can rip it apart, I can be angry at it, I can have all of those emotions, and we're still going to read it. We don't change the text because of that, because it's a constant grappling backwards and forwards.
And I think that's a healthy way to go about it, honestly, because you need to grapple with it. You need to say, okay, can I really apply my modern vocabulary, my modern ideas to this passage? Can I just take it as it is? And then say, well, this part of it applies to me, or the overall story is inspiring to me, but some of these parts just don't match up now just because it is old.
Yeah. And I agree. And I tend to think of the people who wrote those words down as doing the best job they could to communicate to us throughout, first in oral form and then later written down by others, the best that we have at what their experience of the divine may have been. So there may be places where they're speaking it in a historical context, and I want to see that, and other places where I want to say, wow, that actually still speaks to me the way that you express that.
Why do you think people get so bent out of shape about being it has to, if it's from the Torah, if it's from the Bible, it has to be this way, and God wrote it, so that's how it is done?
I think that it's from the perspective of many traditions, it has to have that sense that it is coming directly from the divine. It has to be eternal for all time. And there isn't much room. Once you start to pull out a thread, will the whole thing unravel? And I think that it's necessary in that context to keep that whole. What I think is, besides that we've talked about already, another layer of how that's problematic is what are the words that you're even looking at? Are you looking at it in the original Hebrew, and with what tools? When I look at a verse, and if I'm studying with somebody who also knows the Hebrew, we're gonna really delve into what that word is, and we're gonna figure out that none of the translations on my shelf actually do justice to what is in that text. So even just on the level of language, before all the other ways that we apply our lenses, how is it that we can say that anybody can say, this is what the text said? Mm-hmm. I don't think that we actually can, but I understand that for many that is totally necessary to have a clear understanding. This is what the text said, and that's what must be followed.
Right. I also think some of that too is needing to find a distinct answer to questions. Right, this is what the text says, so this is the exact answer, and I'm going to go with that because, I don't want to deal with a gray, mixed up answer.
Clarity is huge. I often laugh, and we're not the only tradition that I think this applies to, but when people are actually working with me towards conversion into Judaism, it's interesting that sometimes they are very attracted coming from traditions that have more of a sense that there must be clear, even I would say dogma, to a tradition where it's, there are so many different opinions and that's more what Judaism is. There's a lot of questioning, a lot of arguing, and sometimes people love that. Oh my gosh, when I was a kid, I couldn't challenge anything in the text. All you people do is challenge. Let's do that. And then I talk to others for whom that's really frustrating. Mm-hmm. They want to know, can you please give me one answer to this question?
Right.
Well, no, I can't, because the tradition doesn't work that way. So it's not that works for everybody, but I think embedded in some traditions or some denominations of traditions, there is really a sense that this is ongoing. Some might even say ongoing revelation. This is a process. We're in an evolutionary process, and we get to argue with the text just as much as somebody in the year 1000 or 200 BCE, perhaps. Even when we're talking earlier. So,
yeah, and it's not saying that anybody's particularly wrong or particularly right, and you could see it one way and I could see it a different way. And, in my personal spiritual philosophies, I work with the idea of mathematical axioms, where each person has their own set of axioms, and that ours can both be true in the same space in the same time, and we're both right, and I use that a lot to explain to people, you don't have to believe the same way that I do to have truth. It's not necessary. And, and it's up to me as the other person to say, this is someone's truth for this moment in time. I have my truth for this moment in time. And if we don't agree, that's not a bad thing. Doesn't mean they're horrible, evil people.
Absolutely. I mean, how can we actually hear each other in those moments and be able to say, okay, I hear that. And I may even hear a little bit about how you got there, which I think is even more important. Like, how did somebody arrive at this place? I think that we can get further into communication in that way.
Well, that's pretty much the crux of this podcast. It's like, how do people get to where they are spiritually and what they do for their spiritual work? And then, and a lot of my own interfaith work, and I'm guessing some of yours too, is kind of based on that. Like, how do we talk to each other? How do we tell our stories? And, how can we live with each other in our differences? Yeah.
And of course, how do we, if we can acknowledge that in each other, that we might just be in different spots, how do we then not negate the other? And that's around so many issues. Like, okay, even if we can say that, how do we get to the next step of, I get the power of self-definition. I get the power of living the life in wholeness that I want to live, without you actually imposing what you just said was your belief on. Like, how do we do that and still be in conversation? I think that there are ways to do that, but it's tricky.
Yeah, and especially when you're dealing with really like not necessarily polar opposites, but really just very different faiths. That's why I tend to get a lot of questions like, how can you practice Wicca and be Christian? And it's like, well, they kind of overlap. And, we're not the only, Christians did have a magical tradition and some still do. So, but when you're talking things like, somebody from Islam compared to Wicca or compared to other faiths like Buddhism, there's a lot in the language there, and like a lot of that you have to really communicate so you can start communicating on the same level, I think.
Definitely. I mean, it's interesting in the work that I do with interfaith families, this comes up a lot. So you're talking about how you can be something in yourself, how you can hold different traditions and philosophies together and actually see how they can inform one another. Well, we have more and more in this country. There's more blending than not. So people are coming from different traditions. They may have, as you're saying, more than one identity within themselves. And then they're also joining with somebody else, perhaps. And now we have multiple identities, and there's not this clear-cut sense that I think a lot of people still hold on to. This is what it is to have a blank household or life or spiritual path, whatever it is. It's not that clear for a lot of people. I think that those boundaries are fuzzier and fuzzier all the time, and that makes a lot of folks very, very uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's been more fuzzy in the last few years. 10 years or so, maybe 20, especially when people are really complaining about the rise of the nuns, people who are spiritual but not religious and that kind of thing. But, do want tradition and do want stuff, but, they don't want a church particularly or synagogue or even, whatever. And, mixing that in families as well is interesting. So why don't you talk a little bit about the interfaith families and what you do with and for interfaith families?
Oh, sure. So I meet with couples and families all over the Bay Area, as do my colleagues in other regions of the country. And our goal is to help couples navigate all the questions, some of the things that we're talking about. Right, how do you navigate that? How can you not feel alone in that? And some of the questions that do come up, I think, are very particular to the age in which we're living in, when a lot of people feel not so connected to religious institutional life, and they're trying to navigate what that might mean. Does that mean that there's going to be a huge loss of one or multiple identities as I chart a path forward? Is there a way to incorporate or even learn more about Jewish traditions or a tradition that someone else was raised in? How do we do that in this day and age? And it's really interesting work, and I get to help connect people. If people would like to be connected to Jewish community and they have felt that there were doors slammed in their face, then I'm there to suggest the right kinds of places now we're in such a different place than we were decades ago, in which there are tons, especially here in the Bay Area, tons of synagogues and Jewish community centers and independent organizations that are completely welcoming and embracing of people, no matter what kinds of identities they're bringing. So part of my job is to connect people if they would like to be connected, and another is to build community and to see what happens when couples are in a room together and can share their stories in authenticity and talk about where the trouble spots might be as they're trying to create a life together. I also work with institutions themselves who are striving to be more and more welcoming all the time. Well, how do we do that? What happens when a kid in a Hebrew school class, for example, after winter break says, "Oh, I got this sweater from my grandma at Christmas." Oh, what do we do with that? It doesn't look like it used to look, and there's a lot more diversity in the classroom and in the institution and in the worship space. How do we navigate that? What kinds of voices can be heard, and in what way? And how can we instruct around what kinds of things are happening in those moments so we can actually go forward in a really profound way?
What's the hardest thing for couples, at least that you've seen, when they are initially getting together and thinking about having a family, or, they've been together a while and are still trying to work on their different faiths and trying to integrate it in their lives?
It's interesting. There are so many different kinds of combinations. So it depends on the kind of couple that's coming to me. I have couples that I work with who are both coming from a very committed and engaged religious or spiritual background, or something that they've come to as an adult. And they're going to have really different questions than two people who are kind of connected to maybe some kind of an identity, but it's not really central to who they are and the kind of home that they're trying to create together. So things are going to come up in different ways. So for a couple in which this is really alive and present, they're going to want to figure out some of the basic things that are going to happen down the line, milestone moments. If they're planning on having some kind of a union, what is that going to look like? How can both people be present and represented? Families, to looking down the road if people want to have kids. There are birth ceremonies that many would think are really canceling one another out from different traditions. So how do you navigate that? And all the kinds of things that are going to come up down the line in life together. And even from the day-to-day to the week-to-week worship, are people going to go to an institution together, to go to church services or to go to synagogue services or whatever it might be, if that's relevant for them? So those are some of the things that can come up. For far more people, it tends to be somebody is really committed to a certain path and the other one is and in either direction, it kind of goes in that way. Right. And I think actually, in some ways, the folks who really are not connected to any of it, it's almost harder, I think, because there isn't a shared spiritual language, and there might be a lot of searching and trying to figure it out. And perhaps cultural identities, especially in Judaism, there's often a stronger cultural identity than there is a religious one or a spiritual one. That's almost harder to figure out. Well, then what does it look like? What do we do? Do we repeat some of the things that have been in place in generations past, or do we chart a whole new way to go? And that can be a greater challenge.
Yeah, and I know, at least from my experience, and even just with my own wife, but I see it a lot in the pagan community, is mixed couples where there's a pagan person and a person who practices one of the more mainstream religious practices, Christianity, Judaism, whatever. And for the pagan person, there's a certain amount of what I've called church burn, where, they've come from a very conservative religious tradition of whatever stripe, and they're coming into this marriage or the relationship. And, the other, for me, when I returned to Christianity, it was really difficult for my wife. because she had all this church burn from her growing up in the UK in the Church of England. So, but it's not something else I haven't seen in other places either. And how do you work with people to help kind of heal those rifts and be able to talk to each other about their issues around the other person's tradition?
That's a really serious issue. And as we see, like with the rise of the nuns and like, why is that rising? So there are a lot of different reasons. But one is that people have been burned by religion. So what happens when then people are coming together with different kinds of burns or different kinds of attitudes, or only one has really been burnt by it? And I really love to work with people around those issues because I think that there's some work that needs to be done. It's one of those things like if you're carrying baggage, better to let's just get it out on the table. Let's talk about it and figure out what kind of damage was done and why and how and who was involved in that. And are there family members that are you carrying around different stories that are connected to people in your life who are present now or lost? I think that that's all really important stuff to talk about. And if people don't talk about that, but just kind of put out there, well, I'm not into this stuff. You go to church, you go to synagogue, you go to whatever kind of spiritual practice you want to engage in, there's a missed opportunity and a real lack of understanding of what drives people. So I really encourage people to dig that stuff up and have some good conversations about it.
I mean, even in my own marriage, we have had really good conversations about it and very healing on both sides of this issue. And I think it's also, a conversation for interfaith work in general as well. Because one of the things, at least in my interfaith work, that I try to make sure that I include when I'm talking to people who have had church burn, it's like, yes, I acknowledge that this has happened to you, and I acknowledge that there are very bad people doing that kind of stuff in the name of God and in this tradition. And I am sorry that you have experienced that. Just validating the feelings and saying, yes, I acknowledge that the tradition I come from has its issues.
They all do.
Right.
I think that that's hugely important. And I think that there's perhaps it's like getting it on the table, acknowledging it and being able to say, yeah, that's there. And I hear you and I'm with you in that. And then I also want to say, depending on what the burn is and how severe, where is the next place to go? So for many, that's just it. And there's never going to be a way back into a spiritual life or a religious life, or maybe a spiritual life, but not depending on how we define those terms. And for others, there might be. And I think that something that especially I see around the LGBT community is if there have been serious burns in that area, I mean, for some, they need to leave. Like really, really. And I've actually, some people have challenged me. Are you saying that all LGBT people need to be you need to find themselves within a religious or spiritual tradition? No. I think that for some, that is not the healthiest thing. And they need to find a way to be in different kinds of spaces and to do the internal work that they need to do around that healing for themselves. For many other people, I think that there could be a place of entry, and we're kind of deprived. Like after that kind of experience, no matter where that's coming from, we're deprived of a spiritual context. If we just say, I walk. I'm out of here. And that can happen for a lot of different reasons. I'm going to hear all the reasons why within the Jewish community people may have walked. And my feeling is, so at this point, it's only hurting. It's hurting the community, fine. But it's really hurting you because there is so much there. There is so much there that could deepen life and life's experiences and a language and a culture and a context for it in a community. So is there a way for us to get to a place where you can find the sorts of places that might be part of your healing, actually, and a really important part of your own journey? So I just don't want that door closed because I think that at some basic level, I suppose my bias is that I think that we all do need it. Not everybody agrees with me, but I think that a depth in spiritual language and life enriches it.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you too. I mean, I think everybody needs something, even if it's, they're believing in the mysteries of science or something, but I could go on about that. But I think for interfaith, I think you're right, especially for LGBTQ people who have been burned, that, making it clear that there are places where people aren't going to treat you crappy. There are synagogues that are LGBTQ completely welcoming. And here's a few, and just trying to help people find those resources, because they may still really want that ritual. They still really want that community, but don't know where to find it, and to find one that's not going to treat them badly.
And there are so many. I mean, I think that's part of what most frustrates me is that it appears, I think, sometimes in our larger culture and in media that religion is monolithic. Right. It looks like this. It speaks with one voice, and here's what the voice is saying. And that is so obviously far from the truth. And I think that folks, especially who have been through certain kinds of religious experiences, might not know the variety that's out there, not even just across the religious spectrum, but even within each particular religion, right, within each particular denomination. There's so much variance. Right. I mean, there are progressive and more little c conservative, because we have a big C conservative movement in Judaism, small c conservative strains within every single religious tradition. Oh, yeah. But I think that a lot of people don't know that. So if they're frustrated around one piece of it, that's it. And religion is then this big whole that we can talk about as one. It's very, very hard to talk about religion as one whole.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of my biggest frustrations in interfaith work. Because it's and I know where people are coming from, because there's the human tribalism thing. If everybody in this little group is X, then that whole thing is X. Okay. I get that that's kind of way we're wired to think about things. But, having done a lot of work to kind of get myself out of that thinking, it gets really frustrating. It's no, you cannot treat all of this religion as a monolith. You can't treat all pagans as a monolith, because we have the whole variety of people. We can't treat all Christians. We can't treat all Jews. We can't treat all Muslims as this big monolith of one particular line of thought, because it's just not true. And I know in my low moments when I'm just really frustrated and I've been on Facebook too long or something, and I'm in that cranky period where it's I'm doing all this interfaith work and nobody's listening to me. That's one of the biggest frustrations. Is I can't say, and at my personal level, I cannot say all of religion X thinks this way. Because when I talk to people, and my podcast really shows it, when you talk to different people, there's so many differences of opinion that you just can't say everybody thinks this way.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the most profound moments for me in rabbinical school was that I did an interfaith seminary program. So we visited other seminaries and different ceremonies, different schools came to us at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and we would have really great sharing around liturgy and theology and contemporary issues, which is fabulous. And at the end of every session, we always went around the circle and just shared something that we wish people knew about our tradition. And almost everybody, every time said, I wish people knew that we were not a monolithic tradition. And I mean, especially within Islam, we heard that every single time, but it really was salient for most religious traditions, that it is assumed that you can speak about this in one way, and then stereotyping and discrimination and all the things that follow. Nobody wants to be boxed in that way.
Right. And you can say, yes, there's commonalities of different thought of different things, and it doesn't really matter what tradition you are. There's going to be commonalities within given groups of traditions. But yeah, definitely, I totally understand that. People think, oh, you're Wiccan and Christian. Well, how can you do that? And, there's this about Christianity that you have to do, and then there's this about Wicca that you have to be. And it's no, I am not. I have my own faith around that.
And there's so much I love that there's so much that's shared across different traditions and practices. That's a beautiful thing. And when you find those commonalities, it's a gorgeous thing. And at the same time, and I see this in couples too, that I want them to find those underlying values that actually brought them together, even if they come from the most different backgrounds possible. At the same time, that's not the whole story. Part of the flavor and unique nature of every practice or tradition is that it is actually really different. And I love that stuff. I don't want to gloss over and say like, oh, well, we're really praying to no, I don't actually think that we are necessarily. And that to me is good. We have really different ways of talking about theology. We have really different ways of talking about what family means in different traditions. These are deep differences. What does it mean to serve our community? What does it mean to be a whole individual? These are actually really different, and there are different priorities. To me, that's the fun stuff. Let's talk about how it's different too.
It's really cool. And that frustrates me with some groups that say that they are interfaith because they tend to mush things together, where it's like they're trying to not offend some people so much or whatever, like they're trying to mix it so much that it just becomes mush. And it's like, well, you could still, bring in elements of ritual, elements of song together and things like that, and still keep the distinctiveness of each tradition or multiple traditions. And I think that's important, because, I think the more you try to kind of mush it together and make it fit, like, to me, it just doesn't work.
Absolutely. I mean, I see this comes up a lot in my work with interfaith families and with Jewish institutions. There's a big question here about, well, if our intermarriage rate is at around 70% in non-Orthodox communities, that's where it is about right now. That's very, very high. Yeah. That means that most of our congregations are made up of a mix of folks. Well, does that mean that it should look different? Should the services look different? Should they be more accessible? Should there not be much Hebrew anymore? Services are traditionally largely in Hebrew, which a lot of Jews don't know anymore, or might know how to say, but don't know what they mean and really don't feel great about that. So how much does that change? And is it time to really make a huge shift? Or is that what actually makes this community the particularity that it is? And that's actually something that not only to hold on to just for the sake of holding on to it, but is that part of what makes it deep and meaningful today?
Yeah, and I think that's where it's important to get input from the community itself. Is it's like, okay, we have these traditions, but we still want to be accessible to people. What is it about what we do that makes you come here and worship with us? And, is it that we do the whole service in Hebrew or we do the whole service in Latin, whatever, is it because we have snacks afterwards? What makes this community vibrant to you?
Yeah, no, I think those are the questions that we need to be asking. And then we need to be prepared for what the answers might be, right. Which is tough. If the answer is, oh, wow, it's really about this other thing completely. Wow, okay, how much do we lose and how do we process that loss? And there's a loss as things morph and change. I just happen to think that they've always been morphing and changing. So, I think that a lot of people want to look back, and I know this happens in Judaism quite a bit, even if people don't necessarily say it in this way. It's as if there's this moment of pure Judaism back there, and it's around 100 or 2. It's way back, and that's when it was. Oh yeah, that was the core, and we've just been straying ever since. That's not actually historically accurate. There have always been different splinters and theologies and ways of interpreting text from its very beginning. There is no sense that there was ever a moment because it had already evolved by that point. So, it's a tradition that's evolving. And this is something that I'm always interested in, how conscious religious traditions and practices are of the fact that they are an evolving entity. And it's a tough one because some traditions, Judaism has that built into it. We still argue about it, but it has it built in that it's of an evolving civilization. We use Reconstructionist language on that. Well, a lot of people from any tradition you can name would say that about their own tradition.
Yeah.
That's not agreed upon by everybody. Or if it is, how do they talk about how change happens or how that evolution happens? Would they ever use those words, or would they use a particular way of framing that that does not necessarily make it sound like we change at the whim of the moment, which is, I think, part of the fear.
And, what surprises a lot of pagans, because there are quite a number of pagans that feel that our traditions are evolving because we're nature-based traditions, which is not necessarily true, because there are some groups that are like, no, we've been doing this Wiccan tradition for this long, and it's an unbroken lines from, I don't know, some other tradition in ancient Greeks or something, and it's like, no, it's all evolving. And it's kind of a weird thing to see that happening. It seems to kind of be a concentration of that now happening in paganism, where people are like, no, we've always done it this way. But then, there's of us like, witchcraft is a very much evolving tradition. And what is interesting too about that is that, I think you're right. Like, people don't really see their traditions as evolving, especially in the major religions. Because, a lot of people, like you're saying, a lot of people really want to think that it's unbroken from way back when. And it's like, I also think that people kind of need to break out of that mindset, especially in the major traditions, because, I don't know exactly what it is, how it is in Judaism now, but in Christianity, people are leaving. Christianity is shrinking, especially mainstream Christianity. Even in the progressive traditions, there's some tradition there. There's some more progressive groups that are actually thriving. Which are more of the open, affirming, welcoming, LGBT friendly groups, which are the ones that I see for thriving. Mm-hmm. But overall, it's shrinking fast. I don't know if that's the same as true as Judaism.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's shrinking. It's complicated how it's shrinking. I think that across the board, we're seeing a decline in attendance at worship services in every tradition. Like, there are some trends that are across the board, so it's not as if one tradition only is facing those challenges. But yeah, I think that there are a lot of factors that go into that. But I think that at large, I think there's a lot of distrust of religion. There's a lot of having been burned or a lack of understanding about it. And I don't think that we talk about it that much. In some ways we talk about religion, in other ways we really don't. Like, we're scared to ask each other deep questions about faith or ritual or how spiritual practices might inform our lives. And there's that sense that, like, that's one of the things you don't bring up at a dinner party. Well, the fact that people still say that, like, oh yeah, you don't really, that's so personal. Right. Oh my gosh, we're so far past the point at which we need to be really delving in and being able to talk to each other about it, because it's causing havoc on a global scale.
Yeah. I mean, just in American politics alone, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just even that one aspect of our life in the U.S. especially. Absolutely. And it seems strange because, like, being clergy, living and breathing theology all the time, it's like, of course I talk about it all the time. But, right, running up into people like, no, don't want to talk politics, don't want to talk religion. And yet, you're right, it's like something we desperately need to really open up and talk about. And, it seems, I think especially with clergy too, like really trying to engage. But I guess that's really hard as well, because people perceive you, like, if you say you're clergy or you're a rabbi or whatever, people are like, oh, I can't swear in front of you anymore.
Yep, absolutely. I've heard that so many times. Yep. Does that mean that I don't get to swear? Oh, no.
Right. Gosh darn it.
Yeah, but there's this untouchable aspect to it. And I think that betrays in some ways a lack of understanding of what the breadth of it is and how it differs from each tradition. For example, in my tradition, we're not necessarily, we're not intermediaries between humans and God in any way. You don't need a rabbi to marry you, for example. It's a totally different role, more as a teacher and a leader in a community, and it's morphed over time. But there's a lack of understanding about what that role means. And that's just one little nuance, but there's so much variety across the spectrum. And I think that we're just kind of terrified to talk about it. But yet there's a major impact in how religion shapes our national debates. So on one hand, we don't really talk about it and we don't really understand, like, what's the difference between somebody who just came out with this major proclamation that's going to lead to actually a legal change? What tradition are they coming from and where are they? Let's learn more about that. There's none of that. And then there's a lot of assuming that we know enough about what that is. And it's hugely problematic. There are a lot of voices we don't hear at all in the public sphere. And it's a major problem. The less that people are connected to religions, I fear that there's even less of a need to ask any of those questions. And it will continue us down a road that is really problematic.
Actually, yeah. And I think, even just not having the ability to learn about religions, like, I know like separation of church and state and all that stuff, but, I think it would be useful if there was a religions plural course in most schools, just so that people have an idea of what are the basic tenets of each of the traditions that exist, like most of the traditions that exist. And, that way, like, I think having those basic understandings would eliminate a lot of the rifts, a lot of the ignorance that we see, especially around Islam. It's like, I took a course in Islam. I'm a million times better for it. And I could say to people, no, that's not what Islam believes. That's not what Muslims do. So, I guess ignorance is the big problem here. And I think religious ignorance is a huge problem.
Oh, I totally agree. I am a major proponent of church separation of state. Church and state separation. I don't think that this is the same issue. This is not about praying in school. This is about learning as history, or kind of a combination of history, civilization, even social studies, and not being scared to have that conversation. How do we, how are we going to go forward if kids aren't learning about this? I mean, even looking at college level classes, how many people are taking those classes as humanities drops anyway as a whole? So we have that problem. But within that, not the biggest classes often around religion. There are major economic forces that are leading us in that direction. I get that. But wow, that's problematic for us to not be able to have that conversation. When I was at Stanford, I loved having conversations with students who came from religious traditions themselves and were taking religious studies classes or engaging in some kind of a study extracurricularly, because they really had to confront a lot of their own upbringing and questions, and now meld in a very academic environment, do some of that holding of the paradoxes that I was talking about before. And those to me were some of the most important. I thought of those as some of the most important conversations that they were able to have during their college years. But that has to be in the high schools. That needs to be, we need to be not terrified to bring up the topic of religion. And I agree, especially around Islam and other traditions that are so misunderstood, yet totally central to what's going on right now in the world and in our country. How can we not know more?
Right. It's like, I don't know, but I am a religion nerd, so
Me too. We're a little bit biased,
right? Yeah, one of the things that I've heard from some of my friends from seminary that came from a little more conservative backgrounds is like, oh, you're going to go to seminary and you're going to lose your entire faith, or you're going to become an atheist, or, they're going to break your faith. And I'm sitting there thinking, in my experience, learning about other faiths and learning more about my own particular faith and the challenge I was getting from other people actually strengthened my own faith. But I wasn't also afraid of being challenged on my faith either. And that just seems like a thing for people. If you challenge them on what the tenets of their beliefs are, it breaks their brain and they feel like they've lost their faith. And I'm like, but couldn't you use that as a way to bolster your faith?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is what happens when people have to, I love to be on the journey with people when they're needing to confront those kinds of questions. And I don't think that it does, that's not what breaks faith. I think other things break faith. I don't think that more knowledge is what breaks it. I think that can be a tough process, no question about it. Whoa, I've got different realities now that I need to integrate. Okay, this is going to be a journey. But I think that it firms where people are and they have a greater understanding of how they got there rather than, I was given this and I will take it in hook, line, and sinker. It's like, no, I need to think about now as an adult. What does this mean? What was I given? And what does this mean in terms of who I am, who I'm becoming? I mean, I love this program at Stanford that's not an academic program, but a fellowship through the Office for Religious Life called FREE. It's a fellowship for religious encounter, free. And people come to the table from as broad a spectrum as they can get every year for about 10 to 15 students. And they delve deeply into religious dialogue. And they don't lose their faith. They become stronger in who they are and are better at describing where that comes from and sharing why it's important to them. It's a really powerful process.
Yeah, there's actually a similar program at Cambridge in the UK for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim people. That is a similar idea where they go and stay at Cambridge for 2 weeks and just delve in real deep to scripture and comparing the Quran, the Bible, and the Torah. And it's just, I applaud, but I didn't get it. I was very sad. But
that sounds like a great program.
Yeah, but it sounds really cool. So people can look that up online. It really is an interesting program. So, but I think those conversations are important. Why not look at that? I mean, I guess not everybody's religious nerds like we are.
I think that it's interesting when people who aren't that immersed in a particular religion enter into that kind of environment. I think that that's interesting too. In fact, at Stanford, this is the context that I know best, but certainly not far from the only college who has this. Within the Stanford Associated Religions, or about 35 or so different traditions, one of them now is atheists, humanists, and agnostics.
Interesting.
In a religious context. I love that. Awesome. Because aren't we all having the same kind of conversation? Even if it's not the same thing, we're having similar conversations. And I love working with atheist, humanist groups around the big questions of life and death and being alive. We can inform each other and share text, we can share poetry, we can share the deep questions that we all have. To me, that's human. We're all asking those questions, or I hope that people are asking those questions. Again, religion nerd, but agreed. This is in a certain context, but I love having those kinds of encounters. It's not that, because we're talking about the same stuff.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, no two people are alike exactly. They may have similar positions on stuff, but, everybody is different. I mean, even just through my own podcast, you just go through my back catalog and, there are people of similar traditions and people of similar faith on there. But, how they got to where they are, their life, their belief is just so different, from mine, from other people's, from other people that I've interviewed. And it's really fascinating to hear those stories because, then you realize underneath it all, it's that humanness that we share that is really important. And I think when people get so bogged down on the nitpicky things of dogma and stuff, they lose sight of that sometimes. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter what tradition with that either. It's any tradition. When you start getting into some of the nitpicky stuff, it's like sometimes you have to step back and be like, oh, wait a minute, we're humans as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So I want to give you a little chance to talk about your book because we're getting close to the end of our time, but I'd like to give you a little chance to talk about your book if you like.
Absolutely. I'd love to. This has been a really exciting project over the last years that has just been published by Skylight Paths just a few months ago. So that's very exciting. And it covers 13 different American religious traditions. And there might be another one with more, which would be fabulous because there aren't enough. We really wanted to cover a good swath of the American religious spectrum, but also really wanted to focus on the traditions that are most influencing our public conversation around LGBTQI issues and religion. So a lot of what comes up is some of the things that we've talked about today around like religion not being monolithic and needing to understand a full spectrum before saying, oh, well, clearly religion has a voice, speaks with one voice, and that voice opposes LGBTQI equality. Well, no, that's actually not at all true.
Right.
And we have, Unitarian Universalists, Reform Judaism, Buddhist Churches of America, which have been actually joining people in sacred unions long before it was on the table as a possibility, even as a civil right. That sometimes these traditions are actually on the forefront of these kinds of questions around equality, not trailing along later when they finally catch up to the national conversation. Okay. So trying to tell some different stories and trajectories that are not what people would necessarily think.
Very cool. Well, we'll definitely have a link to the book on the show notes, and we'll put it on I have a list of books a very long list of books now that have come up in the conversations. So I will definitely add it to that because I think it's an important one.
I mean, part of the problem with having a book like this out there is that it is changing every day. So we actually have a Facebook page as well, Struggling in Good Faith, where we post, my co-editor, Rabbi Devorah Rose, and I post pretty much every day articles that we find about what's going on right now. Because just since the book was published, the Mormon Church had a major proclamation around children not being, that they couldn't be baptized if they're from a gay or lesbian union, all sorts of things that have happened within the Roman Catholic Church. There's a lot of activity and a lot of change in a really short time. So we're trying to maintain a portal where people can really stay up to date on it's an incredibly alive conversation right now. Right. So how do we keep on top of it and really track what all the different traditions are doing? Because there's one day can have a major success in one area and a major disappointment in another.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting because I had done an interview with a woman who's part of the Ordained Woman group of Mormons. And it was right before that decision. And it was just fascinating to hear her talk about what she wanted to change and then some of that come crashing down when they made that decision. And it was just like, wow, I think that's one of the main reasons why we need these discussions because, we need to kind of evolve together as well, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, when that happened, writer who had done, we have a collection of people coming from within religious traditions themselves who wrote the chapter on their particular tradition. And the writer who wrote about the Mormon Church wrote me an email like the next day. I can't believe this. And I didn't get it in the book because the book is now done. And how could we not have that story? And he had actually just been elected the head of Affirmation, the Mormon LGBTQI support group. So there's it's a sad story what's going on, and at the same time, there is this body of people who have been doing this from not within but outside of the church, but have been creating safe spaces. I just spoke at Dignity the other night, the Roman Catholic LGBTQI support network, and they've been doing this for years and years and years within every tradition, even the ones who are having the most trouble around this and are struggling the most. There are places of safety and places where people can bring their whole selves.
Well, just like, how we met was at City of Refuge, and being a very queer, very trans-friendly Pentecostal, Methodapticostal, church. And so, it does shock people, though, when you tell people, like, yes, there are places you can go, and I can try and help you find one in your area if you're not in my area. But if you're in the Bay Area, especially,
it's all over. Yes. So walking away if you need to, I understand, but if you don't want to, it's there. So there are people, we can help folks find places that are going to help them actually embrace everything that they are. And I just want people to be able to bring their full spiritual selves to everything they do, as opposed to like, I'm fragmented. I can bring this part of myself here. I can bring that part of myself there. So I think that we're on the way.
And just so people know, we will both be willing to help you find places.
Absolutely.
But if people would like to contact you specifically, especially, if they want to talk specifically about Judaism or, about any of the topics we discussed here, what is the best way to get in touch with you?
That's a great question. We have a website for Struggling in Good Faith. So that's a good place to get in touch with me if you don't remember what I'm about to say. You might remember the title and find us online.
Awesome. Well, we're going to put that all in the show notes so people can find it there. And or they can email me and I'll hook you up. It's all good. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Great. Thank you so much. I've loved the conversation.
I'd like to thank Rabbi Mychal for joining us on This Week in Heresy. You can subscribe to This Week in Heresy via iTunes, the Stitcher app, or the podcatcher of your choice. You can also financially support this podcast through patreon.com. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave me a message through Twitter at TWIH Podcast or on thisweekinheresy.com.